Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to wish a very, very happy birthday to Dr. Robert Moog, the man on the left. The man on the right is, of course, one of the most famous performers on the instruments that Moog invented, Keith Emerson. More about that in a second. But Robert Moog was the person who sold the first commercial synthesizer, and it changed music as a result. This was, of course, the modular Moog, that big behemoth standing behind Mr. Emerson there. And it changed music for many reasons. Let's look at it from a psychological perspective, first of all. This was one of the first mainstream instruments that created music invisibly. Now, what do I mean by that? When you look inside a piano, when you press the key down, you see the hammer going up and then going back down on the string of the piano. When you pluck or bow a violin, that's something visual. When you strum a guitar, or if you pluck a bass, or if you blow into a horn, these are things that you can see. When you hit a drum, very visual. Even the organ, the electromechanical organ, the most famous of which was made by Hammond, that was by definition a mechanical process. You could see what's going on looking inside the organ. And even the great mellotron, when you look inside, you can see the tape head coming up or down to meet the tape and play the sampled recording. But the Moog synthesizer was all analog circuitry. Visually, it was very impactful from the outside, but unlike the inside of a piano, the lay person, the regular old chap, couldn't really see what was going on. But the sounds were incredible. It was pure sound in that the performer was manipulating sound waves to create various frequencies that, when played by a piano style keyboard, made music. Very, very novel at the time. Of course, the modular unit was too big for any band that wasn't Emerson, Lake and Palmer to go on tour with, so the Mini Moog became the instrument du jour for everyone ranging from Chick Corea to Rick Wakeman to funk bands to pop music. It was everywhere. Disco, the Moog synthesizer was everywhere in the 70s and really even started to rear its head in the late 60s. The Beatles used a modular, for instance. Everyone at some point used one of Moog's products, the Mini Moog being the most famous. But by the mid 70s, there were polyphonic models, the Poly Moog, and all that means is that you can play chords. The modular and the original Mini Moog, they were monophonic, so you could only play one note at a time. That itself had a huge impact on music because it changed the way that keyboardists would solo. Usually, chords are thrown into a piano solo or an organ solo, but when soloing on a Mini Moog, your right hand, for most right-handed keyboard players, is just flying and doing really interesting things one note at a time. Again, Chick Corea, marvelous at it. Rick Wakeman, marvelous at it. Keith Emerson, marvelous at it. Herbie Hancock was a great synth player. Joe Zawinul, a great synth player, although he tended to adopt synths more when they became polyphonic by the mid 70s. But Robert Moog, of course, made those as well. Tony Banks used a polymoog, for instance, of Genesis. And so the instruments were ubiquitous in so many genres of music. And although there were other synth companies, Moog was the first, and it was in the 60s and 70s into the early 80s the most well known. ARP was obviously also a very good company around this time. By the 80s, a lot of competition popped up. There was sequential circuits, which made their profit polyphonic synths, the Prophet 5, the Prophet 10. There was Oberheim. Roland made very well beloved keyboards, the Jupiter 8, for instance, that Eddie Van Halen used. Korg, there were so many. And by the 80s, there was more variety among the expensive ones that I've just named. And there were also now more affordable ones, particularly those coming in from Asia, that a lot of the new wave bands that were sort of starting in garages, people like Depeche Mode and Ultravox, would use. But even though as a company, Moog closed in 1987, The synthesizer revolution that Robert Moog inaugurated did change music forever. Almost every kind of music after Moog relied on synthesizer in some way or another. And look at the most popular music, frankly, from the 80s till today. Much of it synth derived. In the 80s, you had the sort of modern dance music, you had new wave, you had the pop of the 80s, much of which didn't have any acoustical or even electromechanical instruments. You could have had a drum machine or electronic Simmons drums. You could have synth bass. You could have lead synth. You could have a synth for the chords and not even require the guitar, the most common instrument in contemporary pop music. And that is thanks to innovations that Mr. Moog, Dr. Moog, I should say, made as early as the 1960s. And look at hip hop. You've got samples, and the sampler, the digital sampler anyway, was something that the synthesizer paved the way for. You have synthesized beats in a lot of hip hop through computers. You have samples, you have lead synth lines. Dr. Dre, for instance, loads of lead synth all over his best works. And so all of the music that came after Moog was in one way or another influenced by him, with the exception of maybe bluegrass music or folk music. But if you were plugging something in and using electricity, chances are you were influenced by the creations of Dr. Moog. And this again is another example of how sometimes it's the musicians who take existing instruments and change music, and sometimes it's the invention of a new instrument that changes music. Much of the time, these two things intersect. Look at the saxophone. It was an instrument that was relatively new compared to the other European orchestral instruments, and Adolf Sax wanted his instrument to sit alongside the brass and the woodwinds of major European symphony orchestras. That didn't happen, but it became the essential instrument of American and particularly Black American jazz. So he invented an instrument for one purpose, it was used for another purpose. Similarly, Dr. Moog didn't necessarily think he would change rock and roll or dance music or pop music in general, but he did. From progressive rock to fusion to experimental jazz to dance music, as I said, it changed it. When Les Paul made his electric guitar, something similar happened in terms of early rock and roll, and frankly, rock and roll through the decades. A true pioneer, a very interesting man, an artist and scientist at the same time, and a really, really good friend to all of the musicians that played his instruments. Every musician that knew him well, and many did, could vouch for that. Sadly, he died a number of years ago, but his legacy lives on both on the streaming services, in music history, and in a music shop near you. So here's a salute to Robert Moog. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.